there's no question in my mind. It's not even close. I mean, a European style nymph rig will outfish a indicator style rig 10 to 1.
I'll actually walk right through the stream if I'm not coming back and not planning to fish that area again, just to purposely try to spook those fish and see where they were hiding.
Where can a fish be comfortable and get the most amount of caloric intake without spending energy?
False casting with a nymph rig is no bueno.
The thingamabobber for me is for nymphing streamers or for nymphing really heavy setups. That telegraph effect will basically make you miss fish.
In this episode of the Gritty Angler podcast, I discuss nymphing with professional fly fishing guide Derek Olthuis. This is part 2 of our nymphing podcast. In this episode, we discuss fishing with a bounce rig and when you might consider using one. We talk about fly selection versus presentation, and is choosing the right fly as important as overall presentation. We also discuss rod setup and a few common knots that are useful when tying on a nymph rig.
You mentioned a second ago, or earlier in the podcast, a bounce rig.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that and maybe some tips you'd give guys in terms of being able to get flies down to depth. You know, whether it's 5 feet, maybe even 10 feet.
So a bounce rig, for those that don't know, is the weight is on the very bottom. You have an indicator, and then you have a few flies on a tag section hanging off your main leader.
Yeah.
So if this is my main leader here, I'm going to have a few tags that are tied on and hang off maybe 6 inches with a fly on them. And so what that allows me to do is...
And real quick, what's the knot you use for those tags?
Most guys use a triple surgeon's knot. And so where I connect 2 pieces of line together, I'll just leave one of those tag ends and I'll leave it, say, 6 to 12 inches long. And then when I tie my flies, I want it to hang off maybe 6 inches or so.
6 inches off the main line.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if I have like let's say I'm fishing a 4X and a 5X section that come together, then I leave that 5X section of the tag just hanging off like 6 inches or something, and then that's where I tie my fly to.
Gotcha.
Essentially what the bounce rig does though is the Provo River, for instance, in Utah is a perfect example. It's one of the best rivers to fish a bounce rig on. And the reason being is in the summer you get a ton of moss in there and there's just a lot of snags and things. And if you fish a traditional float indicator nymph rig where it goes fly, weight indicator, then the flies get down in the junk and every single cast you have to pull the moss off your flies and it's just not efficient. And so you have this bounce rig where it goes weight, flies, indicator, and it does a few things really effectively. One, it gets you right down to the bottom and you can adjust where your flies are along your leader to get to where those fish are. 2, because you're not running your flies through the moss and the bottom and things, you get snagged up less. Mm-hmm. Sometimes your weights get a little hung up, but you can just usually pop them off. 3, it will get you fishing along the bottom at the right speed. So because your weights are kind of bouncing along the bottom, you're not necessarily the flies aren't being pulled by the indicator at this upper current speed, right? You're more matching this bottom.
You've got a bit of a drag on the bottom, so it slows that down.
Yeah. So you might have some drag on the weights and your indicator will kind of bounce, right? So your weights bounce and your indicator kind of bounces as it's moving along, but because your flies are up here and they have this tag end, they're not necessarily being drug all over the place. They're kind of free floating in that, right?
How, Derek's getting a phone call.
Just had to exit.
How far from your weights on the bottom to your first tag?
It depends on what I'm fishing. If I'm fishing, let's say, a sow bug that is almost always right next to the bottom, then I'll go about a foot. I'll put a weight, I'll do my knot, I'll have my tag, and so I'm somewhere between, let's say, 8 inches and a foot up from the bottom. So I mean, I'm fishing right along the bottom because sow bugs live right along the bottom.
Yeah.
Versus if I'm fishing and there's a PMD hatch coming off, then I'm going to go higher up with the PMD because they're getting swept off the rocks. They're getting their little gas bubble in their shuck to emerge, and they're moving through the water column. And so those fish will eat those higher in the water column than they might with a sow bug because they know sow bugs live right here on the bottom. But when the PMD hatch is coming off, the fish adjust to that.
Right.
So, yeah, it's all situational. And we've talked about this before, but observation. Observation is key. I mean, if you aren't taking the time to observe, like I say about don't parking lot rig, don't just tie on your favorite rig in the parking lot because that eliminates a lot of guys' observation. Go down to the river, figure out what's going on, take your time, tie something on. Just don't be in the mindset basically where this is what works. This is the only thing that's going to work, and you just tie that on and you stick to that through the day, and then you think, why am I not catching fish?
Yeah.
Just be observant and notice that throughout the day, different bugs are going to hatch. The fish are going to adjust accordingly to it. We saw that the other day when we were fishing for for browns with damselflies.
Yes.
As soon as the damselflies were kind of done hatching, the fish moved and they went back into the deep water instead of working the shallow weed beds.
Yeah, just shut off.
But yeah, so it's all situational where I tie my fly based on what I'm fishing. But the bounce rig it can be really, really effective. And it's nice because you don't get the same slack that you get with a traditional indicator rig because the weight is keeping you tight to your indicator. And so when that fish eats, it's much more direct to the indicator, and it just gives you that better opportunity to set the hook. So it's a good... it's almost a marriage between the traditional float nymphing setup and
right.
a European setup. It definitely has some of the European benefits to it.
Well, nymphing is it's so effective, can be for many reasons, streamer fishing, nymphing. And I've heard different numbers. I've heard scientific studies show 70% of all fish eating happens below the surface. I've heard that number set as high as 90%, but again, whether it's 70 or 90, that's a big number. So fishing something that's under the surface should be very effective.
Yeah. Yeah, the majority of the time, I think nymph fishing is going to be your best bet. I mean, I think a lot of guys are drawn to dry fly fishing because it's fun. It's fun to see a fish come up and eat a dry. But most of the time, dry fly fishing is the least effective method because even if a fish has to move, let's say they're sitting in 2.5 feet of water. If the fish is on the bottom and he has to move 2.5 feet to eat every time, that's a lot less effective than sitting right here and just moving, a few inches over in the current to eat bugs that are drifting down there.
Yeah. Yeah, and in general, the fish that will move that far are smaller fish.
Yeah.
They have to, because they need to find food to grow and compete with the big boys.
Yeah. Well, and, a little dry fly, let's say a blue wing olive, is going to be a bigger meal for a small fish than it is for a big fish. So if a 6-inch fish sees that blue wing olive, rises up, grabs it, that's a heartier meal for that fish than it is for, the 20-inch trout that's down here eating nymphs. He sees that thing goes by and it's not even worth his effort to go up and grab it,
Yeah.
It goes back to my analogy of the big fat guy sitting in his lounger, chilling out. Is he going to put a bowl of popcorn or a bowl of Skittles or something in the kitchen, and every time he wants one, get up, walk over there, grab one, come back to his chair, watch some TV, eat that one, get up, walk over there, grab the one, come back, sit down, watch some TV, pop it?
No way. No. That dude wants the whole turkey.
Yeah. He's going to bring his bowl. He's going to set it right here, and he's just going to grab as much as he wants while he's eating. And that's how a trout is going to feed. He's going to sit here and he's going to just eat as effectively as he can. And unless there's some kind of a hatch to really draw that fish up in the water column, nymphing day in and day out is going to be your most effective way.
Yeah. What is the most number of times you think you've changed out your rig or your flies in the course of a day? Because this is something I have trouble with. And when we fished together 2 days ago, I didn't take the time to change out what I should have changed out. I just want to keep my fly in the water, and you assume something's going to grab it eventually.
If I can see that a fish is behaving in a certain way, then I'll change out flies a ton to get that fish to eat. So for instance,
because for me, it's a lot easier just to change out a streamer versus a nymph rig. That is time consuming.
It is super time consuming. And sometimes it's not effective to change out a nymph rig, because sometimes it just might be that your drift isn't right or your weights aren't right and you're not getting quite down to the level of the fish. And that plays a huge difference. If once again we go back, if the fish is feeding right here in the water column and your flies are coming here, that fish isn't going to come up like this every single time to grab a nymph. It's inefficient for him. He's going to sit down here and he's going to feed, along the bottom and just make it super effective to eat down there, and so a lot of times it's more about adjusting your weight or your presentation to get to the right depth of the fish. That being said, and going back to what I was saying earlier, is if I can see a fish and he's behaving a certain way and I know that my flies are getting to the right depth, then I change flies, and I'll change flies a lot. So on the Provo River, I'm guiding. I have a client. I bring 2 rods for the client. And as he's fishing, if we're not getting anything, and I know the fish are eating, let's say on a PMD emerger or something, there's times that because the river is pressured, the fish become very selective. Size, color, pattern, all of those things come into play. And so I'll start switching fly after fly after fly, and I'll switch flies on one rig and I'll hand him the rod, and I'll take the other rod and I'll switch flies on that. And if he doesn't catch fish on the rod I just handed him, then I hand him the new rod with different flies on it, and I take the other rod and I switch again, and we just keep going back and forth and switching until I find something that works.
Yeah.
So there's times that I will switch flies a lot. And there's other times that I think it's more about changing your presentation. The majority of the time, I think it's more about changing your presentation or your depth than it is about the actual fly.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Again, going back to conversation with Lance Egan, he kind of mentioned this on a previous podcast, but Fly Fishing Team USA, when they're getting ready for competition, they'll go to the area they're going to fish ahead of time. Sometimes, like when it was in Colorado last year, they went a year ahead of time and fished the exact same week. So say it was third week of August. They went to those waters a third week of August, a year in advance, to be able to fish it in what they're hoping would be the same type of conditions, right?
Yeah.
Generally, same water temperature, same conditions. And then they're allowed to fish it, I think, a few weeks, up to 2 weeks before competition. And then they'll get together at dinner one night, and they'll all throw a fly in a bowl or in the pot and say, this is the fly that I had the best luck on. Well, invariably, everybody, it's a different fly. Every time. All 6 to 8 of them. Nobody says the same fly worked the best for them. So I think fly isn't as much the issue as everything you just said. The right drift, the right depth, and just overall presentation.
Yep. Well, and going back to when we fished the other day for damselflies, I had on an intermediate sink line, and it worked for a few fish, but then I noticed that the fish just weren't interested. I was getting casts in front of fish, and I was hesitant to change because there were fish moving around me, and I just thought, I can adjust, with my rod tip and things. And then I caught myself and just said, hey, stop being lazy and do what you need to do to catch these fish, take the 2 minutes that it takes to change up your rig. So I put down that rod that had the intermediate sink line that was maybe putting me 1 foot to 2 foot under the water. And I grabbed my floating line and I put on the exact same fly. It was just a weightless damsel. And now the fly was sitting 2 or 3, 4 inches underneath the water column.
Yeah.
And I started hooking up fish instantly. I mean, it went from getting a fish to eat, like the few fish that I had before I switched, to I was getting fish every 5 casts for that little bit. And unfortunately, after I changed, it wasn't long until the damsels kind of stopped. But, had I not made the switch, I might not have caught those last 3 or 4 fish that I caught.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And every article I've read about nymphing, they all kind of say the same thing, or one of the things they say is similar. Before you change out flies, experiment a little bit with depth and presentation. And usually that's it. It's not the fly usually, it's your presentation.
Yeah, totally.
So you just got to experiment with casting, with your drift speed, your depth, and all of that. And I'd way rather do that first than spend the time to change out the whole rig.
Yeah, totally. I experienced this on the Provo River, and I enjoy guiding on the Provo, and I think I'm a competent guide and I work hard for my clients, but you're okay. I'm all right. I think there's guys on the river that are just better at presenting the fly than I am. And some of those guys are like Ryan Stokes or Andrew Siegmiller, there's just a lot of different guys, Jeremy Allen, they're just honestly better anglers than I am, situated for the Provo River. And we could be using the same fly and they will outfish me on the Provo River because they just have, they're fishing at maybe just the perfect depth. And it sounds silly, but sometimes 6 inches or 1 foot makes all the difference. So when they're fishing, they just have their rigs dialed in so well that they just outfish me, and oftentimes they'll hand me a fly out of their box and say, I'm using this fly, I'm fishing it here, and I try and fish it the exact same way that they do, and they still outfish me. And I think really what it boils down to is they just have their presentation ever so slightly dialed in better than I do, and they catch more fish.
Yeah. Well, and again, and this is why I go back to, and I think it's not debatable, nymphing is the most technical of all styles of fly fishing.
Yeah.
way more so than streamer fishing and dry fly fishing.
Yeah, totally.
But if you do it right, you're going to catch loads of fish.
Oh yeah, it's by far the most effective way. I mean, like you were saying earlier, the numbers, the science shows that fish eat a lot of nymphs. And for me, I think of it this way. I break it down into 3 general categories of how I fish. Dry fly fishing, nymph fishing, streamer fishing.
Yeah.
When I dry fly fish, it's because there's a hatch going on and I want that visual. I want to see the fish eat the dry fly. But I know and understand that that's very situational and highly ineffective a lot of the time.
Yeah.
When I nymph fish, it's generally for numbers, because when a fish is eating nymphs, then he's oftentimes eating throughout the day. If he's on the Provo River and there's midges, he has to eat a ton of midges to get full. And so it gives me more opportunity to catch that fish. So it's a numbers game. When I want to catch a big fish, not always, but typically I go to a streamer. There's less big fish in a river system or a lake system than there are average size fish or small fish.
For sure.
And typically they eat big stuff. And so, that's how I look at, traditionally, typically, I guess, how I look at what I'm going to use. Am I there, to try and catch just the one fish? Well, then likely I'm going to put on a streamer. Am I in a river system that has a lot of 20-inch fish and I just want to catch a lot of fish? I use a nymph.
Yep.
Situational. I want that visual. There's big flies out, whatever, drakes, salmon flies, cicadas, whatever it might be. I'm going to use the dry fly.
Yeah, one setup I've fished a lot lately, which I really enjoy, is a streamer with a dropper. Mm-hmm. Some type of nymph dropper. And I've had good success with that. Now that's primarily in still water, in the lakes, but it works well. And when I'm seeing the fish closer to shore, it's the streamer that attracts them. And I've watched this happen a lot of times. The streamer tracks the fish and they're coming in at it pretty fast. And all of a sudden they see the dropper and they change course real quick and they'll eat the dropper, because that's just an easier meal for them.
Yeah.
But that's a lot of fun. That's a fun setup.
I know a lot of guys that fish that same setup. They just rig the nymph first and then a streamer, because in their mind, they think that the streamer behind looks like a fish chasing something smaller.
Yep.
But I think essentially it amounts to the same thing, as you're just giving the fish two different options. Yeah.
So Derek, say a guy is newer to fly fishing or just wanting to get into fly fishing and nymphing appeals to him. Let's just talk gear real quick. Maybe some tips on what you'd recommend. Rod, type of line, and then maybe 5 to 10 flies a guy should consider for his nymph setup.
I think typically the best rod for anyone, the majority of anglers, is going to be a 5-weight in a 9-foot length. I think that's just probably the most versatile fly rod out there. I mean, you could get away with fishing smaller streamers on it. You could fish nymphs on it. It's still small enough that you can fish dries. It can handle a good sized river, but it's not going to be super overkill for a small stream or a high mountain lake, you know. And so I think if you're getting into fly fishing, then that's a good option. Now, if you're looking specifically for a nymph rod, then I would go to a 10-foot rod for sure.
10-foot and mid-flex?
Yeah, I would say something that has a little bit more forgiveness. Those stiffer rods they're really good for casting long distances, for punching casts through the wind, fishing a streamer or whatever. But typically when you're nymph fishing, you don't have to make huge, long hero casts.
Right.
And that stiffness will end up breaking flies off. If you're using 5, 6X tippet and you set the hook, you can break off a lot more fish than if you have, like a mid flex or something that has some forgiveness in it.
Yeah, so a 5 weight, either 9 or 10 foot mid flex. What's the first type of fly line he should buy?
Just a floating line.
A floating line for nymphing.
Yeah, probably a weight forward floating line is good. On that rod setup, if he goes longer, like a 10-foot rod, you can even start to consider those smaller weight rods as well, like a 3 and a 4 weight rod.
Yeah.
I know Lance Egan fishes a lot of like 3 and 4 weight rods. The reason being is because I know we're kind of backtracking here, but because the rod is longer, it has to have a stiffer butt section and things, and so it's ends up being fairly comparable. Like a 4 weight 10-foot rod would be fairly comparable to a 5 weight 9-foot rod as far as the taper goes.
Right.
Now, jumping back to the fly lines, I think that a floating line is by far your most versatile line, and if you're doing any kind of nymphing with or without an indicator, it's just nice to have that floating line.
Yeah, and if you do need to get down, you've got options. You can tie on a sinking leader or throw some split shot or whatever. So, yeah, I'd agree, a floating line. What are, give me a handful of flies guys should absolutely have in their fly box for nymphing.
I think your standard stock stuff like a pheasant tail, an Adams, there's like a hare's ear or even an Adams nymph. I've seen them. Any of the midge patterns, stuff like that is going to be really, really good. I would say the majority of fly anglers fish in rivers.
Yeah. And
if you have like a midge in your box, maybe some kind of a sow bug or a scud pattern, those pheasant tails, the hare's ears, a prince nymph, that kind of stuff, you're going to cover a really large base of food.
Yeah.
And they're just, like take a hare's ear or a pheasant tail. It could be a really small mayfly nymph, or if you have a bigger size, it could be a small stonefly or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a versatile nymph for you.
And in general, are you looking at size 14 to 18 in that range, or?
Yeah, typically speaking, right now in Utah, we have a lot of golden stones and salmon flies hatching. They're, bigger bugs that are anywhere from 1/2 inch long to like 2 inches long. And so, of course, in that situation, you're going to have something bigger. But day in, day out, most flies are probably going to be in that 14 to 18 size.
Yeah, again, this goes back to me. I don't like to fish 6 or 7X, and I don't like to tie on flies that are smaller than a size 18.
I don't even, to be 100% honest, I'll do it, but only when I absolutely am forced to.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even like to fish 5X. I don't even like to fish 4X. And I don't like fishing small nymphs. It's just not really my game.
Yeah.
If I see a fish that I really want to catch that's feeding on small stuff, there's a lot of tailwaters in Utah and Colorado that the fish just eat really small flies. Then I'll do it. But generally speaking, I really don't, a lot of time don't see the need for the 6, 7X and the really tiny flies.
What's the biggest fish you've caught on a really small fly?
I caught, I don't even know how big it was. I can't remember if I taped it. I think it was a 26 or 27 inch bow on a size 18 or 20 It's like a little scud pattern.
Yeah.
So there's just a spot where there happened to be a lot of scuds in the water. It was by a small dam, and it was coming out of a reservoir, and it was just pulling these scuds out of the reservoir, and the fish were just down below the dam feeding on them.
Yeah.
And so I knew there were some big fish in there, and I got a big rainbow. But I think in general, unless you're fishing some of the tailwaters in Colorado or things, I oftentimes don't catch a ton of huge fish on real tiny stuff.
Yeah, I know. When you guys were in Iceland a year ago filming for The Hidden, I think Spencer told me he caught a 30-incher on a size 18 parachute Adams, which blows my mind.
I know in Iceland they do definitely those big fish will eat real tiny stuff because there's prolific midge hatches out there. And there's a guy, Nils Fulmer, who caught a 36-pound brown in Iceland on a size 12 chironomid.
Wow.
So,
dang.
Situational, it happens. Big fish will eat small flies, but
yeah,
there has to be a reason for them to be feeding on that small stuff.
Well, a week ago, I landed my biggest cutty to date, that almost 29 inches, but I caught him on a hare's ear. So I tied 4X dropper off my streamer and a size, I think, 14 hare's ear. And that was a fight, man. And I was so worried he was going to break off because I'd never caught a fish that big on that small a fly before. But, man, you can do it.
Yeah.
I mean, if I can do it, anybody can do it.
Yeah.
So going back to setup real quick. So guys newer to nymphing, want to get into nymphing. What are 2 or 3 knots that you think they should learn for a nymph rig?
I think just your standard clinch knot is always a good one. If you're going to attach any of your tippet and stuff, then a surgeon's knot is a good one, especially for that bounce rig, so you can leave that tag end hanging off.
Yeah.
And I always like to tie a loop knot. So the loop knot that I use is a Rapala knot. And for those who may or may not understand what a loop knot is essentially the knot doesn't cinch down tight to the eye of the fly. It cinches down on the line itself. And so you can leave a bit of a loop between the fly and the knot, which allows your fly to move freely. And so I tie a lot of loop knots to my flies just to give it that extra bit of movement so it doesn't look like it's, attached or being drug by something. I think it gives it a little bit more of a drag-free natural movement. But
yeah, for sure. I use that same knot on streamers all the time.
Yeah.
Just so those big streamers aren't impeded, like you said, and can move naturally.
Yeah. Yeah. So surgeon's knot for tippet-to-tippet connections and using that tag end. Any of the cinch knots are good just for quickly attaching flies. I mean, it's such a good knot. And then any of those loop knots, the one I use is a Rapala knot. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Derek, any other tips you'd give guys on nymph fishing?
I think I give this tip a lot, but it's, to me, the most important tip is be observant. Just be observant. If you see a fish behaving some way or you see 2 or 3 or 4 fish behaving some way, there's probably a reason for it. If you're fishing a nymph and for the morning you don't see any fish at all, they're just glued to the bottom, and suddenly in the afternoon you start seeing flashes in the water column and you see fish that are rising up through the water column, that's not for nothing. I mean, there's something going on. There's something that's making that fish behave in that manner.
Yeah.
And take note, be observant, and change up your presentation to target those fish, and it doesn't matter if you're streamer fishing, if you're nymph fishing, dry fly fishing, just be observant and take note of what the fish is doing, and then you can change your tactic accordingly, and adjust your presentation, and you'll catch way more fish. If you're observant and you're willing to adjust your presentation and change things up, you're going to catch more fish.
Awesome tip. Stay focused.
Stay focused. Be observant. Yeah.
Well, cool, man. Good tips, good info. Thanks for coming over.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Everybody, thanks for listening, and have fun out on the water. Stay gritty.
Fellow anglers and outdoorsmen, let me share a quote with you. There is a delight in the hardy life of the open. There are no words that can tell the hidden spirit of the wilderness, that can reveal its mystery, its melancholy, and its charm. The nation behaves well if it treats the natural resources as assets, which it must turn over to the next generation increased and not impaired in value. Conservation means development as much as it does protection. Those wise words are from Theodore Roosevelt. Please remember that our right to fish depends on habitat. Let's be good stewards of our fisheries and fight to protect and preserve our public lands. Thank you for listening to the Gritty Angler Podcast. We appreciate your support and love hearing your feedback. As always, good luck on all of your fishing adventures and stay gritty.